we talk about sitting on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, right? You can't stop that. It's already happening. So why would we just bury our heads in the sand? Whenever we make things too restrictive, too onerous, or we don't work with people, they're going to find ways around it. They're going to backdoor the process, and then we're ultimately less secure.
Who says tech can't be human?
What's going on, Hacker Valley fam? Welcome back to the show. Life brings up interesting things. And I say that because with our careers in cybersecurity, we work and we meet a lot of people. And you never know how much of an impact one person may or may not have just by working with them. And a few years ago, I ran into someone that I really enjoyed working with in my early part of my career. It was actually my first job. So we thought it would be great to have a podcast episode, catch up, and I would love to introduce my very special guest this episode with you all. My special guest is Whitney Palacios, who is the CISO at BigBear.ai. Whitney, always good to see you and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ron. It's good to see you, and thanks for having me.
What do you focus on these days?
Yeah, so, I left the government in 2017. Which was a very large shift. That was my entire career, was supporting the government and the military until then. And I went into a different role than I am in now. So now I've been almost a year at BigBear. And so BigBear is a Maryland-based AI company that I kind of laugh because having just come back from RSA, right? AI is the buzzword at RSA. And so everybody now does AI, if you ask them. But BigBear has actually been around for a pretty long time. It's multiple different companies that came together. About 5 different companies had merged into one when I joined. And I think the oldest of those companies had been around for almost 30 years doing discrete event simulation. And so BigBear kind of had already carved out this niche doing discrete event simulation for manufacturing, logistics, and a lot of government contracting. So it was a really interesting challenge for me. And it was a bit like coming home, being back in the national defense space, right? I stepped away from that for 7 years and now I'm back, and it's a really great feeling to be able to contribute to that sort of thing. But the other thing BigBear did since I joined is we had another merger where we picked up another company called Pangiam. And Pangiam is known for visual identity products. So they're behind a lot of the technology in use at the different airports, nationally and internationally. So a lot of the things that you see behind like Clear and other things, the scanning technology itself. So that's kind of what we do. We have 3 different real industries that we're in. And I am the CISO at that company. So I'm trying to help do 2 things. One is address the cybersecurity challenges. You're very traditional. How do we protect the house? How do we protect our company, our intellectual property, all those things? And that's kind of your standard cybersecurity gaps and playbooks and things like that. And then the other piece of what I am doing is a very forward-looking. So as an AI company that is trying to sell products, that is innovating and coming up with amazing products, you have to also account for laws and regulations that are in some cases still being written. So how do we best posture ourselves so that we can address these as they come up and continue to be profitable while still innovating?
When I go to events, I always love to ask CISOs, what is a CISO? I'm sure that you have to explain that to many people that you work with, exactly what it is that you do. So someone is half paying attention, right? Like many people do when they ask, what do you do? What do you typically say to describe the CISO role, but also to capture their attention, to let them know, remind them that security is something that they should absolutely be aware of?
That's a good question. So I'll start with the what is a CISO? So the Chief Information Security Officer role, and I have heard CISO, CISO, and I've heard CISO from one person. I'm not going to call out the works for me, but he says it all the time. I've heard that they're all the same thing. So I've also heard Chief Security Officer in different plays. And the reality is the role is very different at each organization. You can find 50 different CISOs that are kind of, there's going to be a lot of commonality, but they're going to have some different roles. And it really does depend on the business, the goals of the business, and just the culture. So I say that because, like, when I'm looking at what I do, a lot of that forward-leaning piece, that's not written into the job description, right? You don't see that very often because that's what usually your CTO is doing. And I'm not trying to take their job. I'm trying to work with them to enable them to be successful. And so that's just kind of one part. But when you're talking about the role, it's information security officer, not like cybersecurity officer, which already confuses people. And for an organization like mine, where we might have spaces that are doing classified work, or we may have reasons that we have paper, like all those things are still in play, even though it's not really defending against cyber attacks. So I would just say it depends who you ask. You're going to get a very different answer.
Right. And when I work with many of our partners at Hacker Valley, we work with a lot of cybersecurity brands. They ultimately want access to the CISO. They want access to the CISO so they could talk about their products, get their feedback. And a lot of the times they want feedback on SOC operations, or they want feedback on their AppSec practices. I think SOC is a big piece, and the SOC is changing. And I feel like some CISOs have a SOC, some don't. So where do you fall with, SOC or no SOC?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think you know a little bit about my background, so I'll just go right there. So when I first left the government, I had never worked in a SOC. I had worked in very high op tempo spaces. I had worked in operational, I won't say centers, but offices, right? We talked about cubicle farmland. That's cube land. So I had worked there, and I would say in a lot of ways there's some similarities to what you see in a SOC, the very fast paced, like reacting analysis, triage, all of that. But I landed in a job at a health insurance company that needed a SOC. And so I had to build one from scratch, right? And in that case, it was very much like, what are we trying to accomplish? And that is really ultimately, once you answer the question, what are we trying to do? What are we solving for? That answers the question of SOC or no SOC right there. So if it is, we are trying to protect this very sensitive information, whether it's classified or there's federal guidelines, and it has to be US only and this, that, and the other, then that may mean you have to have a SOC, and it's going to have to be on-prem, or you have to have a SOC and you're going to have a dedicated private cloud, whatever the case is. As soon as you answer that, I think the rest kind of follows through, and then you can determine based on that, like which regulations are in play here. That determines your SLAs, which ultimately will drive the tools you use, certifications of those tools. So it's a lot, but it really does boil down to that. And so in that case, we built an in-house SOC. Things evolved quite quickly. And like the whole moving to cloud evolved very quickly during that time frame. So we ended up ultimately kind of shifting away from that very brick and mortar on-premise environment and doing some outsourcing and using cloud services. So the position I'm in now, when I joined, we're a smaller company, a much smaller organization. And so you really have to have that honest like assessment of what are the skill sets that we need? What is the actual like operational tempo going to look like? How many events are we responding to? How many logs per second? Like all these types of things that we get into. And if your answer is we might only look at a couple things a day, it's very hard to justify having a fully trained SOC staff. In that case, it makes much more sense to call one of the vendors that does this and outsource.
Being in the CISO role, one thing that is always brought up is accountability. When it comes to the risk for an organization, someone's got to take the fall if it's a cyber risk. And that risk is brought to light, and then there's an exploit and a breach. Someone's got to take the responsibility. It's typically the CISO. So how is it holding or sharing that responsibility? And, how do you also keep your team accountable on top of that?
Yeah, so that laughter is like nervous laughter, like, yeah, because we know that that's very true, right? And any of us that get constant news feeds, there's always a headline about CISOs worried and accountability and liability and all those things. It's kind of like
they want the headline.
It's a constant stream, right, of seeing about the Joe Sullivans and the Tim Browns. And so frankly, it is something that I think about because we do know the CISO historically has been the scapegoat when something happens, right? And it doesn't really matter why or how that was the case. I think that we're seeing a shift in that in the industry because the reality is organizations have started to figure out that you need them there during an incident. If something happens, you need the expertise there, and you probably want to keep them once they've been through it. as long as what they're doing is like ethical and professional and they've done things to the best of their ability, then it doesn't make sense anymore. So I've seen that shift a little bit. Perhaps I'm a little overly optimistic, but I do think that that's kind of slowly turning. It's a very different situation if your CISO didn't act in the best interest or they didn't do due diligence or due care. That's entirely different. So I always tell the team, whether it's the executive team or, I'm speaking to the organization or just my team of direct reports, I always tell them at the end of the day, if you go back and look even at like SEC speeches that have been made by their leaders at conferences, they always say the people that hear from the SEC, the people that hear from the government and these regulatory bodies are the people that didn't do it right. They didn't try to do the right thing, because I think at the end of the day, if you're trying to do the right thing and in the best interest of your shareholders, in the case of a publicly traded company, then I'm not as worried about liability. And since I know for me, kind of my two core, I guess, leadership traits have to do with accountability and integrity. Mm-hmm. I'm just not going to worry about that, because I'm very radically honest with my team. Like, I don't look at an orange. Do not put me in prison. I'm not going to do it.
I need to jump in for a second and share some details about a special group that we've created for you, our listeners. We understand the importance of creativity in cybersecurity, and Hacker Valley has created a special Cyber Creators Mastermind. Each month, we meet and discuss how to break down technical concepts through stories, the intricacies and opportunities of using audio and video to highlight what's important in cybersecurity, and we share how you can use content to highlight the hard work that you put into your craft. You can check out the mastermind by visiting hackervalley.com/mastermind. We'd love to help unlock your creative potential and would love to see you there. And, speaking of the shift in culture and mind, there's still today not that many women CISOs. I think, I look back early when I came out of the government space and looked at, this space. There was a few. Like, there's one of our friends, Olivia Rose. She's been a CISO for quite some time. I think she's been a CISO at MailChimp and many other places. But when I look around and go to a CISO event, there's maybe like 1 to 2, maybe 3 women CISOs. Yeah. Is that what you see in your circles?
Yeah. So the first kind of CISO event that I attended was when I was with Blue Cross Blue Shield at one of the plans there. And I went to one of their CISO work groups, which is a fantastic thing. So make sure shout out to all those guys. But I walked in the room and I looked around and I was like, it's like 2 women in the room, right? I didn't realize that might actually be pretty good given the size of the audience. So, we just came back from RSA where, I saw you there. I went to, on Sunday, before RSA started, they have their Cyber Leaders Forum that they had just started this year. So it was a room full of CISOs, I think like 80 of us, something like that, from around the world. And after I'd been there for about 5 minutes, I went to like the breakfast line to get coffee. I looked up and it kind of came flying out of my mouth. I was like, well, you're number 6. And this woman looks at me, she's like, what? And I was like, you're number 6. And she was like, I think 7, there's one over there. I didn't even have to tell her what I meant. She knew out of 80 people, there were 7 women. Mm-hmm. And that was an international group of CISOs.
As a Black man, there's not very uncommon that I'm one of few Black people in an environment. And I never asked myself, how do I feel about that? Maybe I don't necessarily have too strong of an opinion. I think it would be cool to see a lot of diversity in many areas. But I always wonder, like, at what point are we doing a good job? At like what point would you say, like, oh, there's many more than I thought there were? Like, at what point do you think that you would say that in a room full of 80?
Well, my gut reaction to this question, at the point where I don't count, that's when I think we're probably doing a good job. Yep. When it doesn't even occur to me, oh yeah, I just raised the percentage significantly by showing up.
There's a popular saying that success breeds success. I think diversity breeds diversity. Like, if you bring in people that aren't the exact same, especially being from different parts of the world. I think that was the really cool part of us working together, is we worked with people from all over the country. And then every 4 years on average, they would have to move and do that all over again. I think that, if the more diverse people that you bring in, you'll see your organization also have more unique answers as well. I think more creative answers. Like you might look at person A, they got to a solution one way. Person B showed you a completely different path. I think, things like that are very special.
Yeah, there's some pretty strong research on it at this point about better outcomes, better business outcomes specifically when you're involved in the problems.
Yeah. And, on the note of diversity, everyone is talking about artificial intelligence, and you happen to work at a company that has been doing AI before, we got all obsessed with it and started calling everything as AI now. I think CISOs have a very unique opportunity. Embrace AI or push AI, push it away. How do you navigate that as a CISO, working with your team that probably or is already using AI?
That's a great question. And again, these answers are from me and me alone.
Yeah.
So not representing my peers out in CISO land or even Big Bear, but just me. I think any CISO that says we're going to push AI, we're just not taking this risk, I think that is a foolhardy mission. And the reason why I say that is because it's going to happen regardless. I think, we talk about sitting on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, right? You can't stop that. It's already happening. So why would we just bury our heads in the sand whenever we make things too restrictive, too onerous, or we don't work with people? They're going to find ways around it. They're going to backdoor the process, and then we're ultimately less secure. So I just don't find that, at least for me, I don't find it to be beneficial or useful. So I kind of break the problem up into two categories. There's like the AI internal to our organization, and these are things we are using, whether it be for productivity or to help us with development, or whatever the case is. And then there are things that are external. So for internal, this is where I think CISOs need to be sitting down with general counsel, sitting down with your CTO, your business, and talking about, okay, what is going to be our acceptable use? Let's govern the use of AI within our organization, which models are we okay with? What are we going to do? What are we going to allow, not allow? How do we handle privacy? Do we have all those things? So those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. And once we do that, we've taken a huge step to addressing it and allowing our organizations to go out and innovate, right? We want to encourage experimentation in a way that is safe and, keeps us out of trouble with regulators. And so then on the external side of the house, I also view that this is one I think is just more interesting to me because of my background. I love these conversations about like these AI-driven threat actors or AI-driven attacks. Like it's just so interesting seeing all of this. So there's kind of also that, and I just kind of look at it, break it up into the two, and then even from there I go, okay, what is the actual threat? What is the actual risk? And then where are the opportunities? Because I think just as much as there's all these new scary risks, there's so much opportunity in this space. I mean, down to like developing security protocols, security solutions that work with AI, talking about training, just like all of these things. So rather than be scared of it, I would rather embrace it and kind of be out working with the problem.
Are you excited about any AI use cases and applying them to your security practices?
Yes. So I'm excited about a lot of things, but I love AI, first of all. I love the idea of large language models anyway. We could have a whole conversation about how most of this is not AI, but that's not what we're going to do today. So I love large language models. I think that they can make life much easier. Even outside of just defensive security practices, we've seen so many cases where large language models have helped provide diagnoses that would be missed because of bias, right? Like all these just different incredible use cases. So I'm really excited about the technology and where the industry is going. My organization does some really cool things with AI and with language models that I love. I'm just like really proud of the work they do. It's so great. And then for security itself, we've had some conversations in the past. I remember sitting with you and Chris in Vegas back in, I think, 2022 maybe, and we were talking about the whole SOAR and SOC and like automation. And so I also look at this like, what can we do here, right? Because we were talking then, like, how much can you automate with your use cases and like in your triage and response and how you handle security incidents. And so I just think that this will help drive all of these things. I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes, particularly as we get to a place where our challenges evolve and our analysts and skill sets are changing so frequently, it is very hard to keep people properly skilled. And so if there's a place where we can use automation and intelligence, I am all for it.
I love that. I try to do that throughout all parts of my business. And it's actually the one piece of advice that I've gotten from many entrepreneurs is you got to find what you don't like doing and either outsource it or automate it. Hopefully you can automate it, but outsourcing is also a great avenue. And thinking of advice, I think it's always special to ask my guests for a piece of advice to share with the audience. So jumping into this new space of being a CISO, you've been a CISO for a few years now. What piece of advice would you give someone that's just starting out? Let's say you're even looking back 2 years, 3 years ago when you first became a CISO. What advice would you have for yourself today?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the imposter syndrome is really strong, especially when you're starting out in this space. And one of my mentors, I called him and I just said, hey, I really don't know if I can do this. I don't know if this is a job for me. And he kind of laughed and he said, if you're not feeling imposter syndrome, you're probably not right for the job.
So how do you, I guess, like, what is it? Just accept that you're going to be new at what you do.
I think it's more of, in this particular role, things change really fast and you have to constantly push yourself to stay on top. You can't just be complacent because regulations change, technology change, your team will change. Like, your team will outgrow you if you're not pushing yourself to stay ahead. So it was just really good advice. And just remember, everyone is there feeling some kind of way. But the other thing I would say to people looking into career advancement and getting to the CISO role, and first ask, like, what is it that you actually want? Why are you interested in the role? Because I don't think it's right for everyone. There are people that have talents that would be absolutely wasted in the role. And there are other people that don't have the right mix of skills to do the job. But there are other leadership roles, for instance, or other roles that are like leading with influence and not authority. Like, it just depends on the person. So I would say, an honest assessment, self-assessment of what it is that you actually want.
Love that. Whitney, thank you so much for spending some time out of your busy day jumping on the mics with me and speaking with me in front of our audience. For anyone that hasn't already connected with Whitney, be sure to check out the show notes or description wherever you're watching. I would highly recommend. And with that, we will see everyone next time.